Officer Miller's recovery marked the beginning of real change in the community. 2 weeks after the incident, he requested a meeting with both families at the community center, his hands trembling as he prepared to face the girls he had wronged. The meeting room fell silent as he walked in, still moving slowly from his recovery. His police uniform was replaced by casual clothes, making him look more human, more vulnerable. The girls sat with their families, watching him with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "I spent my entire career thinking I was upholding the law," Miller began, his voice shaking. "But that day, you taught me what real justice looks like. It's not about power or control, it's about humanity." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 official-looking documents. They were permits for the girls' lemonade stand, personally approved by the city council. But Miller had gone further. He'd worked with local business owners to create a youth entrepreneurship program, starting with free business licenses for kids under 15 who wanted to start small ventures. The police department underwent changes too. Miller, once known for his strict approach, became an advocate for community policing. He started a program where officers would spend time at local schools, not as authority figures but as mentors and friends. The lemonade stand incident became part of their training, teaching new officers about compassion and judgment. The girls' quick thinking inspired a new initiative in schools. The older girl helped design a program combining first aid training with lessons about community service and civil rights. Young people learned not just how to respond to emergencies, but how to build bridges between different parts of their community. A year later, the neighborhood celebrated the anniversary of that life-changing day. The same corner where the incident occurred now hosted a community fair. Kids ran lemonade stands, coffee carts, and cupcake booths, all with official permits hanging proudly on display. Officer Miller was there too, buying lemonade from young entrepreneurs and sharing his story with anyone who would listen. The 2 girls, now a bit taller but still best friends, stood at their new stand, their grandmother beaming beside them. Their sign read, "Sweet Second Chances, Lemonade for Change," and every cup came with a story of how one moment of compassion could transform a community. The local newspaper's headline that day read, "1 year later, how 2 young girls turned lemons into lessons of love." But for those who lived through it, the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the small changes they saw every day, in friendly waves between officers and kids, in neighbors looking out for each other, and in the understanding that true strength lies not in authority, but in the courage to show kindness, even when it's hard. When the paramedics arrived on scene, they found an extraordinary sight. The 2 handcuffed girls were calmly instructing Officer Miller about his breathing, keeping him conscious and stable. The first responders quickly assessed the situation, amazed by the girls' composure and knowledge. "Pulse is irregular but strong," the older girl reported professionally, remembering her first aid training. "He's been conscious throughout, but complained of chest pain and shortness of breath." The paramedics exchanged impressed looks as they took over, their movements swift and practiced. The younger girl had managed to position Miller comfortably despite her restraints, using her limited mobility to keep him propped up against the lemonade stand. The paramedics noted that this position likely helped his breathing during those critical minutes. "You did everything right," one paramedic assured them, quickly removing their handcuffs with Miller's keys. The cold metal fell away, but neither girl moved from Miller's side until he was safely loaded into the ambulance. Their unwavering focus on helping him, despite the circumstances, touched everyone watching. News of their actions spread quickly through the emergency response community. The 911 dispatcher who took their call shared how clearly they had communicated the situation, making her job easier during a critical moment. The fire chief, arriving on scene later, praised their level-headed response. The paramedics later told their supervisor that they'd rarely seen such excellent civilian first aid, let alone from such young responders. "They knew exactly what information we needed," one reported. "No panic, no hesitation, just clear, crucial details about his condition." Beyond the immediate medical response, their actions sparked important conversations in the emergency services community. Training officers began discussing how to better interact with young people, especially in non-emergency situations. The incident became a teaching point in several police departments about the importance of seeing humanity in every interaction. Local emergency response teams invited the girls to share their story at a training session. Their presence in the room, standing at the podium and describing how they overcame their fear to help someone in need, moved many veteran first responders to tears. Their simple message, that everyone deserves help in an emergency, resonated deeply. The ambulance crew who transported Miller kept in touch with the families, moved by the girls' compassion. They even offered to help restart the lemonade stand, this time with proper permits they would help secure. But more importantly, they wanted to sponsor both girls to attend advanced first aid training, recognizing their natural ability to stay calm in a crisis. Inside the busy emergency room, time seemed to move differently. The girls had to make a quick choice when they first saw Officer Miller struggling: help him or walk away. Though their hearts were still racing from being handcuffed, they chose to reach for his radio and call for help. The dispatch operator's voice had been calm but urgent. The older girl remembered every detail she learned about heart attacks, the importance of staying calm, keeping the person conscious, and sharing clear information with emergency services. Her hands might have been shaking, but her voice stayed steady as she described Miller's symptoms. The younger girl, despite her fear, knew exactly what to do with the radio. She'd watched her uncle, a security guard, use similar equipment. She pressed the button firmly and spoke clearly. "Officer down at Maple Street and Pine Avenue. Medical emergency." The dispatcher later said her clear directions helped paramedics arrive 4 minutes faster than they might have. Other kids from the neighborhood had gathered around, some still holding half-empty cups of lemonade. They watched in silence as their friends, who moments ago were being treated like criminals, transformed into calm emergency responders. One boy ran home to get his mom, a retired nurse, but by then the girls had everything under control. The paramedics were shocked to find 2 young girls managing the situation. "Keep doing exactly what you're doing," they said, quickly setting up their equipment. The older girl explained Miller's symptoms, how his color had changed, and when the pain started. The younger one held his hand until the last possible moment, whispering encouragement just as she had done for her grandmother months ago. As they loaded Miller into the ambulance, one paramedic turned to the girl's parents, who had just arrived. "Your daughter's saved his life today," she said quietly. Without their quick thinking, she didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood what she meant. The police chief arrived at the scene, his face grim as he watched the ambulance pull away. He'd known Miller for 15 years, seen him change from an enthusiastic rookie to a hardened veteran. Now, watching the video footage from neighbors' phones, he saw something that needed to change in his department. The local news vans started arriving, but the families decided to head home. The girls were exhausted, emotionally and physically. Their lemonade stand lay knocked over, cups scattered across the sidewalk. But somehow that didn't seem important anymore. They had learned something far more valuable than any amount of money could buy: the power of choosing compassion over anger, humanity over hurt. At home that evening, both families sat together in stunned silence. The weight of what could have happened, both the unjust arrest and Miller's possible death, hung heavy in the air. But there was also a sense of hope, a feeling that maybe this day would lead to something better. The older girl's first aid knowledge had come from a special after-school program at the community center. As she watched Officer Miller being loaded into the ambulance earlier that day, memories of those training sessions flooded back. Her instructor had always emphasized that emergencies could happen anywhere, to anyone, but she never imagined using those skills to help someone who had just tried to arrest her. At the hospital, the tension in the waiting room was palpable. The girls' parents arrived, their faces showing a mix of pride and concern. The older girl's father, a construction worker, paced back and forth, struggling to process the day's events. "You did the right thing," he finally said, pulling both girls into a tight hug. "But I wish you never had to make that choice." The younger girl's mother, still in her nurse's scrubs from her hospital shift, sat quietly wiping tears from her eyes. She had seen countless emergencies at work, but knowing her daughter had faced such a situation made her heart ache. "Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same," she whispered, remembering her own grandmother's words. News crews gathered outside the hospital, eager to interview the young heroes. But the families decided to give Officer Miller privacy during his recovery. Instead, they focused on supporting each other and processing the complex emotions of the day. The girls shared their feelings about being handcuffed, the fear they felt, and the instant decision to help despite everything. The community center director visited them that evening, bringing dinner for both families. She listened to their story and suggested turning this experience into a learning opportunity. "What if we started a program teaching both emergency response and community relations?" she proposed. The girls' eyes lit up at the idea. As they discussed possibilities, the younger girl's phone buzzed with messages from classmates who had seen the viral videos. Some called them heroes, others questioned why they helped someone who had treated them unfairly. The girl looked at her phone thoughtfully before responding. "When someone needs help, you help. That's what makes us human." The older girl added another perspective, remembering her grandmother's stories about fighting injustice with love. "Maybe," she said, "this is how real change happens. Not by returning hurt for hurt, but by showing there's a better way." That night, both families gathered in the hospital chapel, not just to pray for Officer Miller's recovery, but to thank whatever force had given their daughters the wisdom and courage to act as they did. The gentle glow of candles illuminated their faces as they held hands, understanding that this day would change all their lives forever. The revelation of Officer Miller's vulnerability marked a turning point that day. As he lay in the hospital bed, machines beeping steadily around him, memories of the incident played through his mind like a film he couldn't stop watching. The faces of the two young girls who saved his life, despite his harsh treatment of them, haunted his thoughts. The hospital room felt cold and sterile, but it gave him time to reflect. A small TV mounted on the wall played local news coverage of the incident. Reporters praised the girls' quick thinking and compassion, while carefully discussing the broader implications of what had initially led to the situation. Miller watched, his heart monitor picking up pace as he saw himself on screen, watching his own stunned face approaching those children. His daughter, a nurse at a different hospital, visited him that evening. She sat quietly by his bedside, both of them watching the news coverage. "Dad," she finally said, her voice soft but firm, "that could have been me when I was their age." The weight of her words hit him harder than the heart attack had. Meanwhile, the story spread through social media. Videos taken by neighbors showed the entire sequence of events, from Miller's aggressive approach to the girl's life-saving response. Comments poured in from around the country, many sharing similar experiences with law enforcement, but also highlighting how this incident showed the potential for change and healing. The girl's grandmother, hearing about the incident, insisted on visiting Miller in the hospital. She arrived with a container of homemade soup, her own heart medication visible in her purse. "My granddaughters learned their compassion from somewhere," she told him, pulling up a chair. "Let me tell you about our family's history with police officers, both good and bad." For over an hour, Miller listened to her stories. She spoke about her own childhood in the South, about police officers who had helped her family, and others who had caused them pain. She talked about teaching her children and grandchildren to maintain their dignity and compassion, even in the face of injustice. As she spoke, doctors and nurses moved in and out of the room, checking his vitals. Each time they mentioned how lucky he was that the girls knew the signs of a heart attack. One doctor noted that if they hadn't acted so quickly, the outcome could have been very different. The conversation with the grandmother shifted something deep inside Miller. He realized that in his 20 years of service, he had slowly lost sight of why he became a police officer in the first place. He had wanted to protect and serve, but somewhere along the way, he had started seeing threats instead of people, problems instead of community members. The heart monitor beat steadily as tears rolled down his cheeks. The grandmother reached out and patted his hand, understanding in her eyes. "It's never too late to change," she said softly. "Those girls didn't just save your life, they might have saved your heart in more ways than one." Outside his hospital room, the world continued discussing the incident. But inside, a profound transformation was taking place. Miller realized that his recovery would involve more than just physical healing. It would require a complete change in how he viewed his role in the community. The officer's face grew increasingly pale as he slumped against the lemonade stand. His breathing became more labored with each passing second, and the girls could see genuine fear in his eyes, the same eyes that had been so cold and stern just moments before. Despite still being handcuffed, they knew they had to act quickly. "Sir, try to stay calm," the older girl said firmly, remembering her first aid training. "We need to get you help." The younger one, though scared, managed to reach the radio on the officer's shoulder. Her small fingers pressed the button as she'd seen police do in real life, and she spoke clearly. "Hello? Officer needs help. He's having what looks like a heart attack." The dispatcher's voice crackled through, asking for details. The girls worked together, one keeping Officer Miller conscious while the other explained their location. Neighbors who had been watching the scene unfold rushed forward to help, but the girls remained surprisingly composed, remembering to note the time when symptoms started. Another detail from their training. "It feels like an elephant, on my chest," Miller gasped, his tough exterior completely crumbled. The older girl instructed him to sit on the ground, while the younger one kept talking to dispatch. Their small hands, still bound by handcuffs, did their best to loosen his collar and keep him comfortable. Through his pain, Miller managed to motion toward his belt, where his handcuff keys hung. A neighbor carefully removed them and freed the girls, but instead of running away or showing anger, they stayed right there, helping the man who had just tried to arrest them. Time seemed to slow down as they waited for help. The younger girl held Miller's hand, telling him about their grandmother's recovery from her heart scare, while the older one monitored his breathing and pulse. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and red and blue lights began to reflect off the nearby houses. The paramedics arrived to find an extraordinary scene. Two young girls, who minutes earlier had been treated like criminals, now acting as calm and capable first responders. They quickly and clearly explained everything they had observed. When the symptoms started, what Miller had said about his pain, and the color changes in his face. One of the paramedics later remarked that their detailed observations and quick thinking made a significant difference in Miller's treatment. As they loaded him into the ambulance, Miller reached out weakly to the girls. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears in his eyes. Thank you both." The neighbors who witnessed everything had already started sharing the story. News crews arrived shortly after, drawn by reports of young girls saving the life of an officer who had just tried to arrest them. But the girls weren't interested in attention or praise. They just packed up what remained of their lemonade stand, saying they needed to go check on their grandmother. That evening, their neighborhood buzzed with conversations about forgiveness, compassion, and the wisdom that sometimes comes from the youngest among us. The incident forced many to confront their own biases and assumptions, as two young girls demonstrated more maturity and humanity than many adults might have shown in the same situation. It was a bright summer afternoon in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, where two young girls had set up a cheerful lemonade stand at the corner of Maple Street. The colorful handmade signs and the clinking of ice cubes in plastic cups created a scene of innocent entrepreneurship. The girls, both 12 years old, were best friends since kindergarten, working together to raise money for their grandmother's mounting medical bills. The sweet scent of freshly squeezed lemons mixed with the warmth of the day as neighbors stopped by, praising their initiative and enjoying the refreshing drinks. Some even offered extra dollars, touched by the girls' dedication to helping their grandmother. Their small table was decorated with paper flowers, and a carefully written price list showed their business savvy. Regular lemonade $1, pink lemonade $1.25. Everything changed when Officer Miller's patrol car slowly rolled up to their stand. His presence cast a shadow over their cheerful setup, and the atmosphere instantly shifted from joy to tension. The officer, known in the community for his strict approach, stepped out of his vehicle with a stern expression that made both girls instinctively step closer together. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "Do you have a permit for this business operation?" His hand rested on his belt as he towered over their small table, inspecting their setup with disapproval. The girls tried explaining their situation, their voices trembling. "We're just trying to help our grandma," one of them said, holding up their donation jar with carefully counted bills inside. "She needs medicine, and we wanted to surprise her." But Officer Miller wasn't interested in their explanation. He pulled out his notepad, writing down their information while muttering about proper procedures and city ordinances. Neighbors began gathering on their porches, phones in hand, recording the increasingly tense situation. Some called out in protest, but Miller waved them off with threats of obstruction charges. The situation escalated when he began to reach for his handcuffs. "Stand up and put your hands behind your back," he ordered, causing the girls to burst into tears. The younger one tried to explain again about their grandmother, but Miller cut her off. "The law is the law," he stated firmly, though his voice carried a slight tremor of uncertainty. As he secured the first set of handcuffs, something changed in his demeanor. His face suddenly flushed, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, different from the summer heat that had been present all day. His breathing became labored, and his hand moved from his belt to his chest, clutching at his uniform. The girls noticed his distress immediately. Despite their own fear and the cold metal around their wrists, they saw something more important than their situation, a person in serious trouble. The older girl recognized the signs from her school's first aid training, where they had learned about heart attacks and emergency responses. Her grandmother had shown similar symptoms before being rushed to the hospital last month. As Officer Miller's knees buckled and he leaned heavily against their lemonade stand, knocking over cups and spilling their hard work across the sidewalk, the girls exchanged a quick glance. They knew they needed to act fast, regardless of how unfairly they had just been treated.